Welcome. I'm Susanne Luhmann. I'm an associate professor in women and gender studies and the director of Intersections of Gender, the U of A signature area of research and teaching that is hosting this conference. And I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging that we're gathered today on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional meeting place for diverse indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. Acknowledging territory, as I said earlier, I think entails a commitment that our work here will enhance learning about and respecting indigenous knowledges and traditions, and that the research, teaching, and university governance that we conduct on this land endeavors to lead to a wider acknowledgement of and a struggle against ongoing colonial violences. So it's my pleasure to welcome you and to introduce our keynote speaker. But I also want to say, I think this conference is hot. And by that, I mean, if you were in any of the morning sessions, I think we delved right into the real kind of contentious issues that a signature area under the name of Intersections of Gender raises. What does it mean? Somebody asked from the audience when the opening panel is completely constructed out of white women, which I think speaks to what we are as an institution. F. Hamden raised it in the previous session. She said we need to acknowledge that we are a racist, ableist, colonialist institution, and what are we going to do about this? How are we going to change this? Of course, as the director of Intersections of Gender, I hope and I'm convinced that the work that we do here has impact and will lead to conversations about how to change this institution, how to transform our research climate, our research practices, our research policies. And I think Shirley-Anne Tate, our keynote, will take us to the next kind of hot issue that this institution is facing in her keynote today. So I'm really delighted. Let me introduce Dr. Shirley-Anne Tate, who joined the University of Alberta on July 1st, 2019, so she's really new. And she's the designated Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Feminism and Intersectionality. And I think we're really excited at the university to have this chair coming to us. Prior to coming to the University of Alberta, Dr. Tate was Professor of Race and Education and Director of the Center for Race, Education and Decoloniality at Carnegie School of Education at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. Dr. Tate is a cultural sociologist whose areas of research are intersectional Black diaspora and racism studies, with a focus on developing decolonial thought. Her research interests include the micro-practices of institutional racism, the body, race and mixed race, affect, beauty, skin bleaching, race performativity, post-colonial theory, and Caribbean decolonial theory. She's the author of several monographs. Most recently, and I think the book is kind of in the print right now, is Decolonial Ensemble, Transculturation, Fungibility, and Black and People of Color Futurity, which is coming out with Emerald Press. And I have heard it's slated to be published on November 20th. Do you have a copy in hand already? Yes. So it's really at the printer, so we're really excited. And then in 2017, she published The Governmentality of Black Beauty, Shame, Discourse, Iconicity, and Resistance. And in 2017 also, she co-authored Inside the Ivory Tower, Narratives of Women of Color Surviving and Thriving in British Academia. Also in 2018, with Routledge, a co-edited collection, Building the Anti-Racist University, Next Steps. So Dr. Tate has a prolific publishing profile. She has published numerous articles in top academic journals and chapters in scholarly books, as well as research reports. She's regularly invited to give keynote addresses, master classes, and public lectures as national and international conferences, workshops, and public events. She has held visiting professorships in the UK, in Finland, South Africa, and Costa Rica, and was made an honorary professor in the chair for critical studies in higher education transformation at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. So please help me welcome Dr. Shirley-Anne Tate.
First of all, I want to acknowledge that I am also a Black settler, to add on to Susanna's introduction earlier. So, Susanna, thank you very much for such a wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. Colleagues, thank you for turning up. It's nice to see you. Nice to see some of my students as well, and nice to see people I don't even know yet. I look forward getting to know you better, all of you. This is very much a paper that's emerging. It's taken me a while to think about what do I do about that particular phrase. If you're a white man, they would have negotiated with you the minute you were approached. Because, you know, it's more than just a piece of data. It's about women speaking their lives as well, Black women speaking their lives in academic life. So for me, it was very much about thinking about what bodies of value are then put into play in just that one phrase. This is a work in progress, as I say. So it's going to come at it from a variety of directions. So I hope it kind of makes some idea in terms of flow, but I'm still working on it. So any comments you have will be gratefully accepted. That's the first thing. I just want to give you an idea about the structure of the entire paper, because no doubt I'll have to stop maybe 3/4 of the way through or even half of the way through because I'll have run out of time. But that is what it happens, right? That is what it will look like eventually at the end. All right, so let's get to the introduction. The words, if you are a white man, they would have negotiated with you the minute you were approached, could be interpreted as management speak, or even an attempt at white anti-racist empathy in a reading of the Academy which locates white supremacy while distancing this white male subject from being part of and party to it. These words will be placed as a reflection of the everyday institutional anti-Black woman racism, which enacts the violence through and against which Black women work the intersections of gender. If you are a white man, reveal what Charles Mills calls white racial liberalism at the very heart of the post-race white supremacy which we are now faced. If you are a white man brings white supremacy's continuing colonial bodily and epistemological coordinates into view in terms of bodies of value. These coordinates constitute what Moya Bailey and Rudy call misogynoir. These words also deny the place of Black feminist decolonial theory in academic life, and also the necessity for unsuturing from white supremacy in contemporary institutions, which was beginning to be spoken about towards the end of the last panel. For me, if you are a white man is hate speech. It wounds. It is itself the source of Black woman shaming. White empathetic racist hate speech such as this speaks to what Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility and what Gloria Vecca calls white innocence making. It does not speak of the transformation of academia that's needed through unsuturing from white privilege. For Black women, working in the intersections of gender entails working at, with, and through the invisibility of anti-Black woman racism, which touches, but at the same time moves away from the touch of Black feminist decolonial theory and Black women's bodies. These words, meant to salve the wounds of being made institutionally valueless as both subject and producer of knowledge because of race and gender, demonstrate the continuing hatred, contempt, disgust within the white spaces in which Black women work at the intersections of race and gender. If you are a white man, which I will begin to shorten to if, so you know, when I say if, that's what I mean. And I've gone through and crossed out all the other ifs, so we don't get confused. Because if is just a conjunction as well, right? If you're a white man hung in the air between us, as it hangs in the air between us now, because of the visceral shock of white racist institutional truth-telling and the impossibilities it conjures up. If you, juxtaposed with white man, makes us know in the moment of these words' utterance the master signifier body in the institution as opposed to the subjugated racialized presence, the Black woman. The Black woman as stereotype, as valueless, which refuses subjectivity or agency to all Black women. If, as I've just said, is also just a conjunction in the English language, which I learned when I was at school. However, in this case, if is not innocuous. Instead, it surrounded the addressee of the statement with negation and interpolated her as negation, specifically as a Black woman problem. If made her absent because it set up a condition which she could not fulfill. It was not the if relevant for despite the possibility that, but rather the if which called up a condition or an event which was an impossibility. Despite this condition of impossibility, if contained performative force in the moment of its utterance, because it brought the black woman of the predominantly white institution into view. It enforced racist homogeneity as the black woman was brought into being as valueless or as having value only in certain circumstances, such as in marketing the institution as diverse. How many of you in the room who are black women and women of color have ever just been like put in a publicity shoot for an institution? Yeah, me too. If also did something else through its instantiation of impossibility. Remember, this if had not emerged in response to a complaint, but to an event, a refusal to negotiate a pay increase by the institution. If was used as a reading of an institutional decision which was unjust, but which could not, or indeed would not be named as anti-black woman racism, but could have been placed as unconscious bias if there had been a challenge. As a reading of racialized gender injustice, if is also non-performative, to use Sarah Ahmed's work, because it cannot bring into effect black women's equity. Instead, if becomes an alibi for neoliberal post-trade sensibilities, a scene of the emergence of white fragility. If serves to keep racism alive through the accompanying shrug of the shoulder, the shamed look away from this particular black woman's gaze, and that strained, tight-lipped smile as her dismissal as human is accomplished. That if made her invisible in that moment through its attempt to placate, to pour salve on the wound yet to come. It did not salve or placate, though, because it illustrated, for example, how black woman racism, misogynoir, for Bailey and Trudy, works insidiously through constructing barriers to progression, which make black women have to leave the institution. How the possibility of complaint can be stopped through showing that one understands the problem as a white male member of the institution. Also, how white understanding of unnamed institutional racism can be used to attempt to do something else, that is, to suture black women into racist complicity, bringing us on side because we knew that would be the case, so nothing new here. It also shows us how anti-black woman racism continues its institutional life through its very unspeakability, its refusal to be breathed into the air, even though it already surrounds us, whether as ghosts or what Sarah Ahmed calls brick walls. Ghosts or brick walls. The tangible intangibility as black women's valuelessness is brought into view through if. If brings to life the necropolitical and biopolitical power of white supremacy and its attendant whiteliness in institutions. If has performative power. It interpolates you, us, as other, as that which you, us, cannot be. It calls you, us, into being as non-human, when that position can only be occupied by those bodies recognized as white, male, straight, middle-class, elite, and able-bodied, for example. The performative power of if also shows us, in the moment of utterance, the racialized gender power relations at work within institutions, which claim that racism no longer matters, because universities are meritocracies after all. However, if denies this claim and brings us back to who can be human, in the Sylvia Wynter meaning of the term, who is a body of value, a body that is valued within institutional life. As Sylvia Wynter reminds us, the human as white male was established during colonialism, enslavement, and indenture in the Western Hemisphere, as infrahumanity was simultaneously conferred onto the black woman. Enslavement's visual practices of domination, composed of both biopolitical and necropolitical techniques of value extraction, inflect discussions of black women as human and bodies of value. What the Western Hemisphere came to see as valuable, privileged, superior, was figured by anti-Black woman racism, that is misogynoir, even as Black women's bodies were the scene of value extraction, capital accumulation, and reproduction for the white nation within the death worlds of enslavement, indenture, and plantations. Black and Black-white mixed-race women's bodies were configured through discourse, the whip, rape, and concubinage for the service of white citizens, irrespective of class, gender, age, sexuality, or ability. In the context of racial capitalism's value extraction, the Black woman, was branded by the interpolating gaze as racialized, a part of what Sarah Ahmed calls those abject others. For her, others are those the nation can incorporate into its economy, culture, and kinship in order to become multicultural, whereas other others are beyond this possibility. The bodies of others and other others are central in defining both the national body and other others as infrahuman threat to the nation's social contract, while others are liminal at its margins. For Carol Pateman and Charles Mills, as social contracts, employment contracts are about property in the person and create relationships of subordination, and the global racial contract reinforces and underlies inequities in our contemporary world. Here, white women and non-white men, others, are signatories of the social contract, and it is only non-white women who are non-contractors, that is, others. So Black women are non-contractors. As Carol Pateman and Charles Mills make us realize, Black women are at the bottom of the hierarchy created by the racialized sexual contract. If you were a white man, refuses the erasure of imbalances of white male power from the national racial landscape, which means that the viscerality of disgust for its intolerable others, the Black woman continues unabated. Racial branding of Black women's bodies emerged in colonialism and enslavement discourses on and representations of others and others. Discourses of or on racially branded bodies circulate and turn others and other others into commodities for effective identification or disidentification, as is the case for consumable products in advertising. Disidentification or identification's negative affects for Black women, such as disgust, disidentification really, circulate through racial branding, utilizing both image and utterance to create visceral responses based on racism's knowledge. Racial branding intensifies identification and affect to move us in constructing national and individual identities. If you are a white man, sits within the relationalities of disidentification and affect. In the midst of negation, Black women as racially branded bodies become part of corporate and state ideological machineries. We represent equality, diversity, and inclusion. This is focused, of course, on evading pervasive white power and sublimating this within neoliberal post-race rhetoric. Drawing on Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez's work, we can say that Black women continue to be objects of racial capitalism, producing economic, cultural, political, and affective surplus value nationally and globally, within and through our very subjection, within and through their very subjection. Black women's bodies, our bodies, are cannibalized as negation in relation to a national white identity which seeks to deny the continuing racialization of others. Further, whiteness is a racial category based on domination. This is also something that continues to be denied. And what also continues to be denied is that whiteness still imparts privilege, which went to the question that was asked this morning at the end of the first panel. People who were here, you heard that question. In this Fanonian dissection produced by Black-white relationalities, differential corporeal value allied with negative affect accounts for another reading of if. That is, one based on contempt, which remains more palatable than disgust for white institutions, which narrativize themselves as zones of equality, universities or institutions striving for racial diversity and tolerance, where class is the only difference that makes a difference to who or what we can become. All this occurs while we know that if shows that misogynoir bubbles just below the surface. If projects institutional anxiety at seeing race, but also willful ignorance of such seeing to maintain post-race negation of anti-Black woman racism. Negating such racism, of course, works to enable white racial equilibrium, which is this quote here from DiAngelo. If carries shame as hate speech because it touches Black women's psyche. However, the inherent deniability of its negation means that it could be claimed that it was not intended to hurt, not intended to touch in any way. Who's ever had that? I feel like I need to do a pause. You have, right? And what happened? Something really hurtful happened, and then it was, I didn't mean that. Yeah, it's a very common kind of interaction that we experience, right? So this is the next section on hate speech, racism's touch, and white guilt, shame. Black women in universities work in spaces where their bodies are subject to the distortional seeing of whiteness. Black women also have to be kept from disturbing the tranquility of white life, white comfort, white embodiment, and white being, as George Yancey says. Being kept from being a disturbance to whiteness means that working at the intersections of gender for Black women is about working with and through white fear and discipline which cannot be revealed. Fear cannot be revealed because to do so undermines white supremacy, and also overt discipline undermines the post-race equity project in which we're all the same, and of course Black women can be racist too. That's a joke. That was meant to be a joke, but nobody laughed. Relegation of body and theory is the only means left to keep Black women in their place through hate speech, which can be denied as hatred and remade as white empathy or rational judgments of objective facts. This relegation underlies the view that institutional racism evaporates into thin air. We see this repeated a lot through data that I've also collected, but also in people's writing. Its disappearance, its invisibility, leaves Black women as others with the task of identifying the post-race white supremacy which still touches us, which still touches them. To enable us to think about some of that, I find Jacques Derrida's work on touch as a pathway into the self really quite interesting. So I want to relate if to touch. If, as the touch of anti-Black woman racism, invades us because we can be touched from an unheard and unseen position of privilege, as touch always revolves around the other. The unheardness and unseenness of white supremacy is the touch of anti-Black woman racism with which we engage to understand its effects and affects in the academy. Anti-Black racism's touch impacts, even as it is made invisible as its ghosts solidify into brick walls like if. Affect-laden, the touch of if marks Black women's unbelonging on their bodies, desires, career aspirations, knowledge production, and indeed humanness, because they are not heard or seen by whiteliness. If shows that white consciousness of the Black woman as racialized other has significance beyond just the visual. Fanon has told us that how we are seen as Black people impacts psyche and life. The visual is also part of the touch of anti-Black woman racism's relegation. Who's experienced this kind of relegation that I mean? You know, you go somewhere and somebody might look you up and down and then turn sideways, or might not see you at all, like walk past you like this in the corridor and not say a word. Right? Yeah. That used to make me kind of stick to the wall, you know, let people walk past. Now I kind of walk in the middle. You have to find strategies to enable you to survive, right? Visuality is implicated in the touch of the white eye on Black skin, which distorts in that very touching so that individual uniqueness is eradicated. Her flesh becomes Black woman flesh. Her thoughts, Black thoughts. Her presence a form of absence, white absence. I'm just paraphrasing like Lewis Gordon's words there. In universities, the continuing coloniality of power ensures that white racist touch can be denied. However, the coloniality of white supremacy, in which the racialized other is always already known as the native, primitive, carrier of culture, different, inferior, abject, continues within the post-race psychic life of race. Even though now we know race can no longer openly be taken to signify biological differences, especially in places like this. But the psychic life of race remains in affirmations of physical variation within white supremacist notions of racial difference. This is what we see in if you were a white man. What we also see in if is that the psychic life of race in universities glues a particular social order. It glues a particular social order of post-race sensibilities and white supremacy together, because anti-black woman racism does not belong to the right or to neo-Nazis. If performs the task of making anti-black woman racism disappear, even whilst making her sense her institutional valuelessness as white supremacist construction because of relegation. The touch of racist relegation, whether from the gaze, the lack of interaction, the move away, the erasure of black women's knowledge production, carry affects, which Sharon Patricia Holland calls racial feeling. Racial feeling articulates racism's touch, where racism can never be named or refuses to be named, but circulates through the transmission of affects, which are intensely sensed, even though dispersed. Has anyone ever had that experience as well of walking into a room and then you have to walk out again? Nobody felt that. I'm just particularly sensitive, am I? Yeah, I might be then. Yeah. I've walked into rooms where I've gone in and I've been, oh, let me go out and come back in again then. It might be easier next time. The intensity of these affects like shame, disgust, contempt, tolerance remain as traces which we sense when anti-black woman racism attempts to hide its material, corporeal, and psychic effects, because these effects are so familiar that they tend to become invisible. What's interesting about if, as well, is that it is both about racist action and inaction. Racist action produced by if makes the system of white supremacy work, but the racist inaction of if also does that, because collusion keeps white supremacy and entitlement in place. If accomplishes both action and inaction in order to keep white guilt and shame at bay. This is necessary in order to diffuse any potential for the emergence of white fragility, for the charge of that was a racist act. According to Sullivan, there are a variety of opinions on the distinction between guilt and shame, and both are often confused. So let's get the simple definition from her. She says, the distinction is an epistemological, ontological one. I can never say that word. I have some word problems sometimes. English is not my first language, I admit it freely. Okay. The distinction is an epistemological, ontological one. That in the former, that is in guilt, one knows one has committed a wrong. And because of it, one has entered a state of disgrace, which is shame. If, as a denial of anti-black woman racism, represses knowledge of having done something wrong, so guilt and shame are never felt. This denial means that I feel myself to be bad, and I have to expel that which is bad. So there's always this abjection going on, according to Christopher's work, in order that people don't feel guilt. And also to maintain an identity devoid of the stigma of racist shame. If accomplishes this, keeping racist shame at a distance, through locating the problem somewhere else. It locates it in the black woman's body, if you were a white man. But, as we know from Julia Kristeva's work, the abject is never totally expelled and continues to exert its psychic force. Perhaps this is at the base of post-race insistence that because we live in a racist society, we're all equally affected by racism. Thinking like this leads to continuing anti-Black woman racism and more ifs as we go through. But white shame must be avoided because it admits guilt and generates disgrace. White avoidance of shame is necessary because disgrace can provoke an incredible separation between the self and hegemonic ideals. So it is necessary for shame at anti-Black woman racism, at if, to not be examined. Instead, what we have is this if continuing to reproduce injury to others. It's become a positive energy which is used in direct attacks rather than just a negativizing denial and obliviousness. So if continues to be an active force for psychic injury within organizations, where lack of relationality ensures that Black women as others feel racism's touch through if, but cannot say this because of continuing white denial. So if can be read as part of a direct attack on Black women's bodies, psyches, and knowledge production. If really, to me, instantiates white supremacy in the moment of its utterance. So we have the addressee, the Black woman, who receives the if. She might try to block it, but you do get some of it soaking through. So for that addressee, anti-Black women racism cannot melt into thin air because of the shame that they also experience. And this shame the additive impact of shame produces trauma. This trauma is related to our or their experiences of misogynoir and its continual rejection, where they are left to starve outside of the boundaries of ordinary collegiality, friendship networks, ordinary conviviality. We cannot look to white colleagues for any kind of succor. Yeah, we feel shame because they are affected by that with which they come into contact. Again, to quote Sarah Ahmed's work, contact, touch, regulates the relationality of self-awareness that are aspects of the experience of shame in which the self is both participant and watcher. As a participant and watcher, this intensifies Black women shaming as trauma. And the other thing about shaming is as well, you can feel shame vicariously, can't you, by observing somebody else being negated. The invisibility of Black women as classed, gendered, sexualized, able-bodied, and aged, for example, is a common experience within universities. The Black woman maintains homogeneity as Black women continue to be read only through race, which of course does not exist. So if what we're read as does not exist, we're invisible, clearly. Being invisible is a peculiar technology of racist distancing. There are many ways to look without being seen, Louis Ricardo Gordon reminds us. And for those caught in the web of oppression, not being seen is so familiar that it too ceases to function as any kind of circumstance. Invisibility loses its extraordinary dimensions and becomes a part of everyday experience for Black women as they work at the intersections of gender within and through trauma. What is replayed again and again through invisibility and its relations of distance and proximity to the Black body is a violent namelessness committed against Black women, whose familiarity is so familiar that it transforms the protective dynamics of anonymity itself. For anti-Black racists, Black women are not nameless, as is the case in that social anonymity with which we pass each other in the world. They are named. We are the very familiar nothing, established by whiteliness since colonialism, enslavement, and indentureship, with which no relationality is imagined as possible because we continue to be invisible, heard, smelled, touched, and sensed only as white constructions. Absence presencing, I think then, should be included in Derrida's ideas on touch to account for trauma. as an absent presence for Black women not to be extended the touch of relationality to reduce racial distance and acknowledge common humanity is a daily experience. Focusing on touch to reduce distance makes proximity a significant element in anti-racist theory and practice. However, proximity, even skin-to-skin touching of the others, which should lead to us being touched, can also keep anti-Black woman racism in place. No wonder then that proximity to Black women's bodies and knowledge production does not erase racist distancing. The maintenance of distance is based on the past, present, and future of race and anti-Black woman racism, in which anonymity means that one is never touched, nor can one be touching in the sense of not being felt, heard, or seen. Black women are not felt, we're not felt, heard, or seen because the white supremacist construction, the Black woman, make us representative of our race through calling into being Fanon's racial epidermal schema. This racial epidermal schema still spreads out like a second skin, touching us wherever it goes materially and psychically. Because according to Sharon, Patricia, Holland, touch can alter the very idea as well as the actuality of relationships, morphing friends into enemies and strangers into intimates. For touch can encompass empathy as well as violation, passivity as well as active aggression. It can be safely dangerous or dangerously safe. It also carries a message about the immediate present, the possible future, and the problematic past. Touch crosses boundaries in fact and imagination. So I started by talking about the necessity to unsuture from white supremacy, and this is the next part. If prefaced the norm, norms as expressed through institutional culture, norms as expressed through practices like recruitment and selection, and processes like curriculum construction. These norms are not unconscious, but maintain the privilege of those racialized as white and non-whites who support whiteliness. Black and people of color phobia lives on within the libidinal economies of white institutions, organized through repulsion rather than attraction, by phobic strivings away from rather than strivings towards. This is the normative anti-Black woman life of universities. George Yancey describes whiteliness as a social, psychological, and phenomenological racial reality for white people. And this is constructed by an intersubjective matrix where they enact a common being raised in the world, which they see as benign, but which is experienced as nefariously oppressive. Therefore, we cannot label as racist only those acts committed by openly self-ascribed races, because racism is not just about believing in the existence of biological races. If you are a white man, illustrates that we must look instead at whiteliness as the norm within universities. Interrogating whiteliness enables the coloniality of white powers, political, economic, social, imaginative, epistemic, and affective, to stop vanishing into thin air. Interrogating whiteliness makes us note that part of what keeps whiteliness in place as legitimate is the epistemologies of ignorance of racism, and Charles Mills and Sullivan and Tuana, following his work, talk about epistemologies of racism as something that we need to think about. So this is from Sullivan and Tuana. So for them, this is part of the work that we have to do to critique whiteliness. So we have to trace what is not known, and we have to look at the politics of such ignorance, which should be a key element of epistemological and social and political analyses, for it has the potential to reveal the role of power in the construction of what is known and provide a lens for the political values at work in our knowledge practices. We should pay attention to the epistemically complex processes of the production and maintenance of ignorance. Because this ignorance is not about lack of knowledge, it's not about not knowing. It's a very willful turning away from white responsibility for racist harm. If instantiates a turning away, which Frank B. Wilderson talks about in terms of libidinal economy. So if structures a libidinal economy, which we can see operating in universities in terms of affiliation and phobia. I'll give you an example of how that was played out this morning in this very room. Every time we do the University of Alberta statement. This is not a critique of the University of Alberta, by the way, just an observation. My salary is being paid here. But my observation, and it's very good to have the statement that you all read, but the statement kind of absolves any white responsibility, then I feel. Any responsibility for me as a black settler, new black settler, to do anything, right? So the statement has this kind of performative force. We're okay now, we've done that bit. We can get on with the rest of life. And that, again, was behind, I think, the comment that was raised at the back this morning. So this libidinal economy structures the psychic and emotional white life of universities and is very resistant to change, as we can see in If. And that's why it's very resistant to change. It's very resistant to change because it's about anxieties, pleasures, appetites, revulsions, phobias capable of great mobility and tenacious fixation. If demonstrates the negative impact of the tenacious but mobile fixation of anti-black woman racism through impacting employment and promotion, as well as psyche. Right, so I'm going to go kind of further. So part of unsuturing is we have to dismantle what women in the UK that I spoke to talked about in terms of institutional toxicity. We have to dismantle that. And that means opening the white self and the non-white co-opted self to those ideas not seen as knowledge, that morality seen as immoral, and those affects seen as irrelevant to academic life. We must choose to talk the talk and walk the walk. We must practice becoming unsuited to whiteliness, and we must not see it as the normative expectation. We have to develop, in other words, a space of criticality in order to come to terms with the fact of whiteliness and our complicity with and involvement in maintaining anti-black woman racism. I'm going to stop there, Susanna. I've got more to say, but I don't think I need to say it.
Thank you so much. Questions, concerns, responses?
So the card's question is, as a black settler, how do you feel about the way Indigenous women are treated in society today in Canada? I am a black settler, yes. I also come from a society that, also is a settler colonial one. I'm learning a lot about Canada. I think that I need to learn a lot more about the ways in which Indigenous Canadians continue to be treated. I am learning a lot from my students in my MA class, for example. And one of my students, one day was talking about what happened to mixed race Aboriginal children in Australia, the stolen generations who were removed for kind of cultural education, but it was really about abuse and providing like a cheap labor force for white settlers. And my student Nola, I don't think she's here, and I know she won't mind me saying this, Nola said, but that still happens today here in Canada. And I said, shame on Canada, that still happens today here in Canada through the work of the Social Services Department, which is supposed to be benign and helping to care for people. So I think that the way in which Indigenous women are treated in Canada today is also reflected in what I've begun to hear about the missing women and girls, right? So again, shame on Canada. Shame on us for being in this room a site of privilege and not thinking that this is something that we need to organize around as well. So, as a black settler, I think that I need to learn, clearly, a lot more about Indigenous history in Canada, about white complicity in genocide and devastation, and also about the role of other black settlers within that as well. I can't say, oh, I didn't know, or oh, I'm not a part of it because I only arrived in July. I can't also say I will try to do better. I have to do better. And the way I can do better is through my work and through more engagement. So how do I feel about the way Indigenous women are treated in society today in Canada? I have to say I'm appalled at the levels of racism that exist.
I want to tell you that I work with my language through reconciliation to revive our indigenous Dene language, which is near extinct because of the horrific history of our nations in Canada. In Alberta, I come from the north remote area. My experience with what you are talking about with the political, the social, the economic, how the land in our area is changed, how our languages are challenged, how we are so broken up in our families, our relationship. We are grappling with our kinship, our language, and we are invisible in the university as Indigenous peoples. I'm scared to go in here. It's a dinosaur. And inside that dinosaur, there's racism. And it hides very nicely, like you said. And it takes many forms, and it changes. You feel it, you sense it, you see it in how people talk, how people look at you, and how people treat you, and how people don't want to listen to you or hear what you are saying or not saying. My language is the only thing that I have. In our songs, we're trying to save it so we can put it at the Rutherford so people can listen to it and hear it, but not after it's transcribed or translated. I will not allow myself to translate it because we want to protect the form. We want to protect our language. We want to contain it and put it in a box. That's what we were taught. I came from a residential school. Many of my classmates are gone. Many of my children's friends from junior high to high school, many of them went missing or dead. Many of them were found in the fields here around Edmonton. The only thing that I can tell you is the truth because that's all I know. And I am not ashamed today because of your if and because of what you said about the pedagogical learning. To step out of my shame and say that I can talk my language. And that's my heart speaks about a history, where I come from. And I'm not afraid because sometimes it comes in whispers. I want to thank you. Masi. Tu tenés ni tu dehote. Masi.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging in the difficult questions and raising them. But also really want to thank Shirley-Anne Tate for taking us there. Thank you so much.